The message from you was brief on Sunday. Sirens sounding again. But even in those 3 words, I felt your tension. That once again, as in 2008, 2012, you were having to scramble down the stairs or even take shelter in your apartment because the fallout shelter down the road is closed. And though the chances were low that you would actually get hit by a rocket, you still had the feeling that this might be the rocket that hit you. And even when the siren stopped, you would live your life waiting for the next time that you heard the blast. I could feel that tension. And I could see that tension in the change of your messages over the past few weeks. That having started off basically reporting on what would become a war between Israel and Gaza, that you would shift. There would be less about what Israel was doing in the conflict and much more about how Hamas was lying, about how Hamas was firing yet another volley of rockets, about how Hamas was preventing foreign journalists from operating to show the real truth of the war. You would put out messages from others who tried to explain that the media were biased, that somehow they had it in for Israel, that they simply didn't understand. And I felt, and I think this is right, that you were also saying that the media didn't understand you, didn't understand the position you're in. Hopefully you know that while I can't be there, I have a sense of that. But I still want to ask you, despite all that tension, to try to move beyond that. To try to think not only of your position, but of those of your neighbors in Gaza. Neighbors who don't have a fallout shelter open or closed down the road, who don't even have an air raid siren, who have maybe 4 minutes to evacuate the home in which they have lived for decades, who get the so-called knock on the door, the small missile that causes a bit of damage, and know that they have to scramble for their lives before the big knock, the deadly knock, strikes moments, minutes later. To have some type of empathy for neighbors who are now in shelters with no idea of when they can return to their homes. Not just a few neighbors, but 200,000 of them, 250,000 of them, more than 10% of the population of the country next to yours. To have some empathy for children, young people, mothers, and men in shelters who are not safe, that there is no place that they can go to find security. I ask you that, knowing that you have spoken out, you have written fervently about the right of all people in Israel to live in safety, how you've spoken out about racism and about discrimination against the Arab population, and said these are people too. These are people who deserve rights and recognition. And I ask you to extend that same call for Gazans. I'm not asking you to endorse Hamas, who are not completely in the right and indeed who have committed many wrongs that have contributed to the destruction of the past few weeks. I'm not asking for you to renounce your government and to say that they are completely to blame, to vilify them for so-called war crimes. Both sides have contributed to the tragedy that is going on right now. I'm asking you to go beyond blaming one side or the other, simply to call for a space which is an alternative to the fear, the death, and the destruction. I'm asking you to do that not just for the Gazans, although it's primarily for them, for they carry the largest burden, the largest chance of death in this war, but to do it for yourself, that you don't have to undergo this fear yet again, to undergo this tension. Because here's the one thing that concerns me. The war in 2008 didn't stop death and destruction and violence. The war in 2012, the one where you hid without a working shelter, that didn't stop it either. And this war will not stop the violence either. Unless there is an actual ceasefire, which means discussion and dialogue, we'll be at the same point a year, 2 years, 5 years from now. You'll still be tense, scared, fearful, and I'll still be talking to you down the lens of this camera. wondering if there's anything that we can do. You might say, well, you can't. You might say that the Israeli government is so entrenched, that the anti-war movement is so contained, unable to demonstrate without fear of violence. What would a voice raising these points mean? But I'm asking you to do that. Because it's not a question of whether or not it makes an immediate difference. It is actually speaking out in the moment. Actually speaking out to say there has to be a different way. Even if you know that message might take some time to get through. And then your voice will be heard above those sirens and above all the voices of politicians who have brought us to this point. I hope you hear this, and I hope we can talk further about it. And I hope that the sirens will now be quieted for some time to come.